Welcome back to Self-Siety. It is October 29th, 2024, and this is the ninth prediction for the 24 U.S. presidential election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And on this channel, if you've been following, thus far, we are projecting based upon a model I'm using with actual real votes cast up to now, along with previous or past voting data or habits or trends. In particular, I'm using the NBC website, NBC News Decision 2024 website, that shows all votes that have been cast up to now nationally in each of the states. Up to now, there's been over 50 million plus votes cast either by mail or early in person. So I'll be going to each one of the states, for example, Arizona, and you can see that so far there have been 1.3 million votes in Arizona by mail or early in person cast. Then we look at the breakdown based upon either Democrat or Republican. So far, 42% of those votes have been by GOP, 35% from Democrats, and then the remaining 23%, which you can't see on the screen, by independents. We'll be only counting for the Democrats and the GOP. How we break down the independents will be basically a 50-50 split, and then we'll be accounting for maybe 1% moving toward the Democrats, only in that's how polling is suggesting early on the voting's going thus far. And then an additional maybe 1 point coming from GOP over to Dems, as that also appears to be happening. That's what we're finding with the actual votes. We're not using polling, we're actually using real voting data. Because so far we found polling doesn't work that well. Now the other thing we got to understand is this is all early voting. Whether it comes in mail form or in person, it's all early voting. So it doesn't tell us how many Democrats will be actually showing up on election day to vote and how many GOP and independents will be showing up to vote on election day. For that, we have to go in our past history, and we're looking here at the polling or the voting history of the different parties. Here you see in red Donald Trump and then Joe Biden here in the blue. And then it breaks it up from 2020. And of course, that's when we had COVID. So you expect a lot more people voting or casting votes by mail, whether that was coming from Joe Biden or it was coming from Donald Trump. But because Donald Trump very much informed people that it was unsafe to vote by mail, that is why we saw that only 38% actually showed up, or only 32% voted by mail or absentee versus Joe Biden 58%. Now that began to change as COVID went away and Donald Trump began to suggest that let's go ahead and vote by mail so that we can get the numbers early on, and it tells us a lot of data that will help our campaign. So you see somewhat of a shift if we go to 2022, where 36%, or it went from 32% to 27% voting by mail or absentee. That also shrunk by mail or absentee for the Democrats. So why is that? Well, because COVID disappeared, and thus up to 73% of people voted in person, either early on or on election day, for Donald Trump, and then for Joe Biden, that was around 54%. Now, polling does suggest about 60% of Dems are expecting to vote early by mail or absentee, and roughly 40% of the GOP is expecting to do the same. So basically we have a reverse, but data does suggest that we're going to go with numbers that look at how things have been through history. And you can see that, let's see, we had it here somewhere. Okay, I'm not being able to find it, but let's just say it this way. Voting trends have been increasingly that people are voting early on, either in person or by mail, and not actually showing up on election day during the presidential elections. To the point that it used to be around 90% back in 1990, whereas in 2016, before COVID, it had dropped to around 60%. Using that trend line, we would expect 2024 to be right at around 50%. About 60% of those showing up on election day to vote for GOP, and about 40% showing up for Democrats, independents being about 50%. And that's what the number we're going to be using for our model. Now, if we go over here, then you'll be able to see that is the spreadsheet I've created where I'm using early voting data. Now, what you see here is 2022 show up for each of these states. For example, 72% in the state of Texas showed up to vote early, either by absentee or mail or in person. And so then what percentage of that we're expecting in 2020, because during presidential elections they tend to show up less. They show up more frequently, that is, during election, on election day, than they do during midterm elections. So that's what we're accounting for, why you see the difference here. So I've created a multiplier, so about 60% of those that actually showed up in Texas during the 2022 midterm election should be showing up during the presidential election. That is roughly what we would expect. So I'm breaking that down using 60% for Dems, 40% for GOP, and 55% for independents. Now, what I've noticed, there's been more data suggesting actually more GOP are showing up early than anticipated. So that number has now changed, where I'm expecting that actually about 55% or 58% of Dems will be showing up early. And for GOP, I'm expecting about 48%, and then roughly about 50% of the independent. So with all of that, I've come up with what's called a multiplier, and we're using that multiplier to determine how many votes should be cast on election day using this model. Then we add how many we're anticipating on election day if the election were held tomorrow, along with how many votes have been cast thus far using our website on NBC News. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So you see the map here. We're starting out with 226 for Kamala Harris and 143 for Donald Trump. Now, these are the states I'm including as swing states: Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. I've also included Iowa because early voting does suggest 48% are Dem to something like, I want to say 45% for GOP. Sorry, that 42% for Dem, 39% for GOP, and 19% for independent. Now, with our multiplier, we then multiply that into how many votes have been cast for either Dems or GOP or independent, and then we add those together using our multiplier with our multiplier, add those together, account for our differences, and then we come up with the total. Now I'm going to go ahead and black all this out so we don't get distracted by each of these states, and we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so the first state we're going to go to is the state of Georgia, and in the state of Georgia, you see that roughly 6.1 million votes have been cast. Of those, 37% going to Dem, 52% for GOP, 11% for independent. Now, even with that 11%, that's not going to be enough for Kamala to catch up with Donald Trump. So I think clearly, even with all of the independents going over and even a little bit of GOP, we're still expecting a good chunk of that to go to Donald Trump. So I'm going to give Texas over to Donald Trump. Bring it to 226 Harris and 183 Donald Trump. All right, moving on to our next state in the lineup. And what do we got here? We've got something going on with our multiplier. That's what it is. I forgot to add my dot. Okay, now moving on to the state of Georgia. The Democrats are catching up a little bit there, but still not enough. 45% of the 3.1 million votes cast for Dems, 49% for GOP, and 6% for independents. When it's all said and done, we're expecting about 4.3 million for Dem and 4.8 million for GOP. That's a very clear win of about 500,000 votes. So we're going to give that to Donald Trump at this point. Now, that was a difference of almost a million about 3 days ago. So Dems have caught up quite a bit, but it's still significantly way behind. At this point, I've got it 226 Kamala Harris and then 199 for Donald Trump. Let's move on to our next state, and that is the state of Arizona. And at this time, there have been a total of about 1.3 million votes cast. Of those, 35% for Dems, 42% for GOP, and 23% for independent. Now that's quite a large independent group, but she would need at least about, what is that, 2/3 of that to even break even with Donald Trump at this point. So it's very unlikely she's going to be able to catch up. But right now we've got a difference of about 300,000 votes when it's all said and done. If the vote were held tomorrow using this model, Harris going to pick up about 2.6 compared to Trump's 2.9. So to give Arizona over to Donald Trump. All right, so that brings it to, sorry about that, 226 Harris and 210 for Trump. Moving on to our next state in the lineup, and that is North Carolina. And in the state of North Carolina thus far, we've had 3.1 million votes cast, 33% to Dem, 34% to GOP, 33% for independent. So this is very close. That's a significant amount of independent votes. Could very much make a difference in that state. Again, I'm not sure why this is all coming out negative. Let's take a look here. There we go. All right. North Carolina, we're expecting Dems to pick up about 4.6 million compared to GOP's 4.4 million. So, or 5 million. So we got about a difference of 100,000. Right now, that's shifted back over to Kamala Harris. So at this point, it looks like she's got the state of North Carolina, 242 to 210. That's as it stands today. Now, the last projection we did, that was to Donald Trump, and the one prior it was Harris. And then prior to that, it was Harris and then Trump at the very beginning, the first video we did. And this is all dependent on the number of votes that are being cast and where they've been cast and the batch of votes that come in. This is how close it is in the state of North Carolina. There's literally bouncing back and forth. All right, moving on to our next state. At this time, and that's the state of Nevada, there's been about 700,000 plus votes cast, and of those, roughly 35% have gone to Dems, and 40% have gone over to the GOP, and then remaining to the independent. And when it's all said and done, we're expecting, if the vote were held tomorrow, we're expecting, okay, again, we're doing this thing is problematic. About 860,000 compared to about 1 million for Donald Trump. So this state of Nevada going over to Donald Trump as it stands right now. Okay, so let's just get this sorted away because this keeps bouncing back and forth. All right, now let's go ahead and go to the state of Wisconsin. And so far in the state of Wisconsin, there have been about 1 million votes cast, 36% going to Dems, 23% for GOP, and then with all of our multipliers, we've got about 1.1 million expected for Harris, and about 850 expected for Donald Trump, giving Harris the state of Wisconsin as it stands today. So it brings us 252 to Donald Trump's 216. Let's go ahead and go to the state of Iowa. In the state of Iowa, there's been about 450,000 votes, and with our multiplier, we're expecting 697,000 votes compared to Donald Trump's 660. So interestingly, as it stands right now, it looks like Harris is going to pick up the state of Nevada, or Iowa rather. If that's true, that is unprecedented. I don't think that's happened since Barack Obama. So 258 to Harris's, to Trump's 216. And let's just go to the state of Pennsylvania, or Michigan rather. And in the state of Michigan, we've had so far a total of about 2 million votes cast, 48% going to Dems, 41% going to GOP, 11% to independent. Now they caught up quite a bit. This used to be like 48 to 20 something. So there's still time. There's a good 6 days of voting left for Donald Trump to catch up in the state of Michigan. But as it stands right now, Harris is picking up about 300,000 votes more than Harris, giving her that state. And with those 15 electoral votes, it looks like Harris has enough to win the presidency. But we still have 2 more states. Let's go to the state of Florida. And in that state, we've had well over 5 million votes cast with a multiplier. Harris expecting about 6.6 million compared to Donald Trump's 8 million, giving him that state. So 273 Harris, 246 Trump. And finally, the state of Pennsylvania, there have been about 1.5 million votes cast, 59% of those from Dems, 31% from GOP, 10% from independent. And as before, the GOP is catching up quite rapidly, actually. So there's still enough time for Donald Trump to take the state of Pennsylvania. But as it stands right now, Harris is expected to get about 4 million votes compared to Trump's 2.5 million. And clearly it's not going to end up that way. So expecting GOP to really catch up, especially on election day. As we know, GOP tends to show up much more during election day than does the Dems. But as it stands right now, Kamala Harris has the state of Pennsylvania. So that brings Harris to 292, to Donald Trump's 246, and that's where we stand today. Now, what I would say overall is that the trend lines right now are favoring Harris in the short term in the states of Iowa and North Carolina, but in the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the trends are favoring Donald Trump, although Harris still has a pretty comfortable lead in those states. Again, there's plenty of days left for that to change, especially on election day. So we're just basing this up on where we stand today using this particular model. So subscribe if you like this model, and thumbs up, and hit that bell, and I'll be posting more videos between now and election day. And hopefully, maybe on election day, I'll actually be posting one or two or three videos, just depending on where things are on that particular day, how close it seems to be. All right, good day.